Welcome back to Interview At, where our mission is to help 100,000 people land their dream job. In these videos, I walk through real mock interviews that I have with candidates looking to level up their interview performance and land their dream job. Incidentally, if you would like a free mock interview, you too can go to interviewyat.com and sign up for a mock interview, or use any of the tools that we make available to help you in your interview preparation. This week's candidate was a senior product manager, targeting that kind of early career, early mid-career stage product manager, not quite at the director level, but just quite edging their way up there, but not quite there yet. And the leadership principle, which is on tap today, is think big. The specific question I asked, well, it's an interesting one because it can be used for dive deep or think big. It really, it's one of those that can kind of go both ways. But in this case, we use it for think big. And the specific question was talking about the most complex product design issue that this customer candidate had ever faced. For those of you paying close attention to the questions that they get asked and whether or not it maps to dive deep or think big, in this one, the specific wording that you're looking for is anything that was a radical reimagining, right? The radical reimagining is the tip off here that you're thinking big. It's an out of the box. It's doing something different, right? That's very different than, hey, let's go dive deep on the technical intricacies or some really hard problem that you had to solve that required you to go multiple levels deep. That's the tip off for dive deep. But in this one, the radical reimagining are the words that kind of tip off that this is a think big. Give me an out-of-the-box solution. As always with these videos, I'm going to play back the mock interview in its entirety for this segment, and I will jump in occasionally to give kind of thoughts and comments on why I asked a question a certain way, what I was thinking when the candidate said that, or now that I'm watching it on a rewatch, some new thoughts that might come through. And at the end, we'll go through my assessment of the candidate for this specific leadership principle and some closing thoughts. This question is meant to probe around your somewhat erratic tenures over the last 8 years or so, right? You've kind of been a good number of places. Erratic being a word that I thought might be a bit strong there. But I would specifically like you to walk me through the most complex product design issues that you faced. And, hold on a second, I think, I didn't plug in my screen. All right, well, I'm gonna, as you start answering, I'm gonna grab the power plug for the service. Not specific user interface design, right? But rather a more complex customer interaction model, complex delivery, right? Fulfillment pipeline, anything else that maybe required a radical reimagining of how things had been done in the space in which you were operating.
I think for predictive prioritization, I came into a product that was kind of started as a research project, and it had been in process for some time with the remit of like, get it out the door, ship it, because this is going to be a key part of our cyber exposure strategy and the cornerstone for the company and blah, blah, blah. This could be a very important thing. My first approach was to say, we are trying to ship a new metric for security engineers to base their prioritization on. We're going to want to ship this as a beta or an early release or some name to say like, hey, work this into your workflow, find a way, start thinking about it. And so then 6 months later, we'll be able to show a bunch of data that says, looking back on the stuff we've been publishing, if you had followed our advice, like here would have been the outcomes, and here's some examples of users or customers who like had these great outcomes. I got a lot of pushback on that because
one real quick thing to point out here, and this is something I try to now highlight whenever possible for folks, is when you're starting your answer, it really helps if you state very clearly what your role was at the time. Your role, your level, your responsibilities, that sort of thing. It really helps set context and prevents the interviewer from trying to have to guess to what your specific job function was in relation to the story and what you're about to communicate.
Internally, like marketing and sales had selected a launch date and started telling people about it, and they needed to launch. So my fallback was, let's do a bunch of user interviews and try to understand what we can so we can make changes before launch if need be. We made those changes. That was great. I thought that was a win in terms of kind of delivering something that was useful to our customers. What we discovered after launching was that every single one of our customers had governance and processes and SLAs built into their cybersecurity stance. So they had processes or governance that said, for critical vulnerabilities as defined by XYZ, as defined by the industry standard, we must address within 30 days. So if we came to them and said, actually, half of those you don't need to address because they're not that important, and these other ones over here you do need to address, they're more important, they would say, this is super helpful. They would say thank you, and then they would go do the thing that was built into their bonus structure. It was something we should have understood before shipping. Maybe it was something we missed, but like that was a big whoops for us. I think we didn't understand the dynamics in the market and what our customers were dealing with.
Yeah, just explain that a little bit better.
So
I'm asking the candidate to explain this a little bit better, because up to this point in their answer, it's not entirely clear what the complexity was, right? It sounds more like it's a hard decision, but not necessarily a complex one. And this nuance of the misunderstanding of the incentive structures within their target customer organizations and how that affected their willingness to act on the information provided by the software, that might be more of like a lack of customer obsession issue that's being highlighted here. But to this point, the candidate really hasn't done a great job of making clear what the complex reimagining was. So we'll see if it gets into that in this next part of the answer. But that's why that, tell me more about that, because I'm trying to poke at, hey, is this the thing? This thing about the incentive structure, is that what's important here?
Cybersecurity team at Visa or JP Morgan or any company, they get vulnerabilities that are detected or published. They have all built processes, some built around like PCI compliance or some other thing, where they have an internal SLA that says for every critical vulnerability, we'll address it within 15 days. And then every high vulnerability we'll address within 30 days or 60 days. Our pitch and our value prop was, you don't have the ability to address all of these things. You're dealing with too many. Let us prioritize them for you and give you a better list to work off of. That was the product. What we didn't understand was that somebody it's a director or an executive had tied their bonus and their compensation to, I am going to address this SLA with like 80% accuracy, or like I'm going to address 80% of these. My team will do this. That is the thing that my bonus is tied to. So when we came in with this new product meant to make their lives easier by giving them the same security with less work, nobody used it. They were all interested, but like somebody in the chain had a bonus and like actual compensation tied to this old way of like this previous governance that they had built using the tools that they had at the time. And so that customer interaction was something that we hadn't understood prior to shipping. I think like the longer term solution was to start to build trust and work at the executive level to start to get that governance realigned around our standard and around our metric and our product that we were shipping, to say, hey, you need to address all of the critical vulnerabilities within 15 days and all of the high vulnerabilities within whatever.
So what so missing from this video is obviously the other 5 questions that were asked of this candidate. And what I really liked about this candidate, and it didn't, you have to really be paying attention to catch it, which is he came into the role and the product was already well on its way to shipping. So his role here was kind of get it over the finish line. And at no point does he throw his team under the bus and say, they didn't do this, they didn't do that. But it's clear that what happened here is a critical misunderstanding of what their customer needs were and how they were intending to use the product. And a very common thing with engineers or engineer-led solutions is, we've got a better solve. We built this really cool thing, and not really fully understanding how the customers want to use it or how they think about the problem space then comes into conflict with the actual solution. So in this part of the answer, the candidate could have done a better job of highlighting what the critical reimagining was helping these people rethink how they were working, but still attain their specific goals, right? How they were being compensated. But at the same time, reimagining how they were talking about their product and reimagining how they presented their product, or even the information that was coming out of the product, to better align with how organizations want to work and how they're flowing.
That's a rough one. I'm processing it is a struggle, right? When you've got pre-existing processes that predate you that are going to just, you think you're making their lives easier, but you're not. But What do you think you could have done differently to have surfaced that information? And even if you had surfaced it, what could you have done about it, right? Because processes inside organizations tend to set like concrete, and everybody's concrete is different, meaning it's hard. It's, just because you get through one type of concrete doesn't mean you're going to get through the other type of concrete. So, what do you think you could have done to surface the issue? But even if you had surfaced it prior to shipping, what could you have done about it?
I think we would have reset expectations internally, right? So in our external relationships, we would have done more focus at the executive level, more focus at the, hey, this is not just a new product that you drop into your workflow. This requires changing your workflow. And we hadn't done any of that, right? Internally, we could have set expectations differently that like users are going to start to ingest and use this, but it's not going to affect their processes, like their actual outcomes for 6 months or a year until they change some of their internal process and governance. Instead, we had like a sizzle in the pan where everything was amazing and it's all everybody was talking about for the first like 2 or 3 months. We shipped our fast follow. We started getting it into more of our products. And then it kind of fizzled out and people weren't talking about it anymore because they were getting this frustration of people wanting to use it but not being able to, and then like they moved on to the next shiny thing. So we would have had to, I'd say, change our external communication strategy around who we were talking to and what story we were telling, as well as change our internal expectations and timeline for how long we thought it would be before users started to see value.
And so, if you had to sum up, I think I'll ask that question. If you had to sum up the biggest obstacle that your team was really facing, what would you point to as the biggest obstacle that was in your way of achieving success here?
I would say I'll split it into two. Like externally, our biggest obstacle was existing processes and kind of organizations being slow to move. I think that was something we didn't anticipate super well. Internally, I think the biggest obstacle was an organization that wasn't focused on user value. When I was suggesting we should do a beta, we should understand like how people are going to use this before we tell them to rely on it for production. I was perhaps being too conservative, which is a fair critique. But we didn't have a world where where marketing and sales and engineering leadership were all focused on value to our customers. Many were focused on, can I sell it? Is it exciting? Are we reaching the launch date that we published 6 months ago that we told users that it would hit? Those things are important, but I think that a stronger culture would have been focused on value to customers with the kind of assumption that the other stuff follows.
This is a weird one because ultimately this answer is a lack of ownership masquerading as being too conservative. And that's what allowed this problem to persist, where they ultimately got to the finish line and they had unhappy customers. But the challenge here for this candidate, and it's one of the reasons why I liked so much of what they said throughout the interview, was that their tenure at the company, their level at the company, and their level of earned trust within their organization with their senior leadership didn't necessarily allow them to go rogue, right? And push really hard to get the beta or to push really hard to get customer interviews. And so it's kind of not a red flag for them because they're able to recognize their failings, and that takes a great deal of humility and ability to be vocally self-critical. But at the same time, what failed to land here was a dramatic actual reimagining of a process, right? That didn't land. Like what did they do? I'm not even entirely clear. Like they delivered a thing that their customers didn't use because their incentive structure didn't really align, and therefore they didn't use it, and then they just kind of got bored and moved on to the next shiny thing. So the point of this question is to walk through a situation where you, as the candidate, had to radically reimagine something and a really complex thing. He talked about a complex thing, but didn't talk about how it was radically reimagined. And so that's what failed to land here, and ultimately kind of detracts from the answer. So the assessment that I would have read into the room for this candidate for Think Big is as follows. The specific answer block meant to deal with this issue did not deliver on the premise of the question. The candidate did not demonstrate an ability to think big. However, there were other parts of the discussion that demonstrated parts customer obsession and parts think big in how the candidate was approaching their understanding of the needs of the customer and how best to build products which took overly complex data sets and simplified them to a usable form. Understanding the core issues facing CSOs, for example, is a clear mark of thinking big rather than myopic thinking generally attached to lower level PMs who are focused on features. And so that kind of sums it up, right? It was, the candidate overall throughout the interview was generally very, very good. In this specific instance, the question and the answer didn't really align well. And that's kind of on you as the candidate. You have to make sure that when you're delivering your story that you make sure you bring it back to the question that was asked. And this is, quite frankly, is one of the bigger challenges with just interviews as they're constructed today, which is it ends up being this weird gotcha game where if you haven't prepared for that question exactly and you're not super comfortable with your stories, you don't have the ability to kind of ad-lib your way in the first few sentences and tie the story that you're going to use, because you're going to ad-lib your way through your story, which you haven't really prepared the right way. That's why we talk about using the FAQ format for that. You can see my other videos for that. But if you don't do that well and you don't tie it up at the front end of the question as you wander through your answer, eventually you're going to lose the thread on what the question was. And when the interviewer goes back and reviews kind of how you did, that question still remains, which is, did they actually answer the question? In this case, unfortunately, they did not. But there were other enough things to like here, and this wasn't as senior enough of a hire to really have it be a huge red flag. Rather, there was a lot of other good things that I saw here that was like, oh, he did this, and that's great, he's thinking about this. So that made me feel more positive generally about the candidate, but definitely kind of missed on the answer here.